In the mid-1970s, scientists looked closely at a single plant and said something that almost never gets said in agriculture. They said this one crop could feed families almost on its own. Not in theory, not as a supplement, but as a complete system. 5 different foods from one vine, seeds with more protein than soy, leaves, flowers, pods, and even underground tubers, all edible. And while it fed people, it quietly fed the soil too, creating its own nitrogen and growing richer ground year after year. What's strange isn't what this plant can do. What's strange is that 50 years later, most gardeners have never heard its name. This wasn't a failed experiment. It didn't suffer from poor yields or disease. It didn't require special chemicals or constant attention. It simply worked without asking you to buy fertilizer, without forcing you to replace seeds every season, without tying you to anyone else's supply chain. If you've ever felt that growing food has become more complicated and expensive than it needs to be, you're not alone. And if learning about plants that quietly give more than they take matters to you, take a second to tap the like button. It helps this kind of garden knowledge reach more people who are looking for practical, honest ways to grow. In many parts of the world, families never stopped growing this plant. They kept saving the seeds. They kept harvesting from the same vines. They kept passing the knowledge down quietly because it worked. In this video, I'll walk you through this plant, the way an experienced grower would, without hype, without anger, just clarity. What it is, what it does, why it faded from view, and why, if you're growing food at home, it might be one of the most practical plants you've never planted. When people talk about productive plants, they usually mean one good harvest, one crop that does one job well. This plant plays by a different set of rules. Instead of focusing on a single yield, it spreads its value across the entire growing season and across the entire plant. Nothing is wasted and nothing is rushed. Above ground, it grows as a climbing vine, strong and energetic but not unruly. Give it a fence, a trellis, or a few poles tied together, and it quickly finds its way upward, opening space below for other crops. That climbing habit alone makes it useful in small gardens, because it grows vertically instead of stealing ground space. It shades the soil, reduces moisture loss, and creates a cooler, more stable growing environment underneath. What makes it truly different is how many ways it feeds you. The young leaves can be picked regularly without slowing the plant down, giving you a steady supply of greens while the vine keeps growing. Flowers follow, delicate and edible, adding color and food at the same time. Then come the pods, forming over weeks instead of all at once, which means you're not overwhelmed with a single harvest day. You pick what you need when you need it, and the plant keeps producing. As the season goes on, the plant quietly prepares one more gift underground. While you're harvesting above, it's storing energy below, forming tubers that can be dug at the end of the season when other crops are finishing. This staggered timing is what makes the plant feel generous rather than demanding. It doesn't ask you to process everything at once or rush to preserve a surplus. It fits into real life. From a grower's perspective, this kind of balance matters. You're not babysitting it. You're not timing everything perfectly. You're working with a plant that understands patience. With basic support, regular water and sunlight, it keeps showing up week after week. That's what abundance looks like in a home garden. Not excess, not pressure, just steady food arriving when you're ready for it. Once you begin to see how much food one plant can provide, the next question naturally follows. Is it actually nourishing, or just filling space in the garden? This is where the winged bean quietly separates itself from most crops people rely on. The seeds are the most concentrated example. When allowed to fully mature and dry on the vine, they contain roughly 35 to 40% protein. That places them right alongside soybeans and ahead of many common legumes. For a home gardener, that matters because it means you're not just growing side dishes, you're growing the foundation of meals. These seeds cook much like other dried beans, familiar and forgiving, without the need for special processing or equipment. What makes the plant even more useful is that the protein isn't locked into a single harvest at the end of the season. While the seeds are forming, the plant is already contributing nutrition in other ways. The leaves harvested earlier add substance to everyday meals. Young pods provide both texture and energy, not just bulk. And when the season is nearly over, the underground tubers reveal themselves as one more source of nourishment, offering protein in a form most people don't expect from a root crop. This layered approach changes how a garden supports a household. Instead of waiting months for one payoff, nutrition arrives gradually. You're not forced to preserve everything at once or rely on outside purchases to fill the gaps. The plant spreads its value over time, meeting real needs as they arise. For anyone trying to stretch a food budget or reduce dependence on store-bought protein, this matters. It means fewer trips to the store, fewer items on the shopping list, and less anxiety about keeping meals balanced. The garden becomes more than a hobby. It becomes a steady, reliable source of nourishment. That kind of security doesn't come from buying more. It comes from growing wisely. As the season moves forward, something important is happening beneath the soil that most gardeners never see, and this is where the plant truly earns its place. While other crops slowly pull nutrients out of the ground, this one is doing the opposite. It's feeding itself in a way that doesn't leave the soil poorer at the end of the year. Along its roots, tiny nodules form naturally. Inside those nodules live beneficial soil bacteria that work in partnership with the plant. Their job is simple but powerful. They take nitrogen from the air, something plants normally can't use, and convert it into a form the plant can absorb. In practical terms, that means the plant is making its own fertilizer while it grows. No bags, no measuring, no guesswork. For the home gardener, this changes the entire relationship with the soil. You're no longer trying to replace what was lost after each harvest. Instead, the ground becomes more fertile over time. The longer the plant grows, the more it contributes to the soil around it. When the season ends, the benefit doesn't disappear with the plant. The next crop you grow in that same space starts off stronger, healthier, and less dependent on added inputs. This is why experienced growers are careful not to overfeed it. Adding extra nitrogen can actually work against you, encouraging too much leafy growth at the expense of flowers and pods. The plant already knows how to take care of itself. All it asks for is decent soil structure, steady moisture, and a bit of patience. There's a quiet relief in working with a plant like this. You're not constantly correcting deficiencies or chasing problems. You're observing, adjusting lightly, and letting natural processes do the heavy lifting. Over time, the garden becomes more forgiving. The soil holds together better. Other plants seem to struggle less. This is what it feels like when the garden starts working with you instead of demanding more effort each season. Less fixing, less replacing, more trust. And for many gardeners, that shift alone is reason enough to make room for a plant that gives back long after the harvest is done. At some point, anyone learning about this plant reaches the same quiet question. If it's so useful, so productive, and so easy to live with, why isn't it everywhere? The answer isn't dramatic, and it doesn't require villains. It's mostly about how modern systems are designed to work. Over time, food production shifted toward models that depend on regular buying, fertilizer each season, fresh seed every year, new inputs to correct old problems. That approach makes planning predictable and profits reliable. Plants that fit this pattern are promoted, refined, and widely distributed. Plants that don't tend to fade into the background, not because they're ineffective, but because they don't create ongoing demand. This plant quietly steps outside that pattern. It doesn't rely on fertilizer to perform well. It produces viable seeds that can be saved and replanted without losing quality. Once you've established it, there's very little you're required to purchase again. For a home gardener, that's a gift. For systems built around repeat sales, it's simply inconvenient. What's important to understand is that this isn't about suppression or blame. It's about alignment. Crops that need constant inputs naturally receive more attention, more research, and more visibility. Crops that encourage self-reliance tend to remain local, passed between growers rather than marketed widely. They persist quietly in backyards, villages, and family gardens, where usefulness matters more than scale. Seeing it this way helps remove frustration from the conversation. Nothing was taken from gardeners. Attention simply moved elsewhere. And when attention moves, knowledge often follows. Over time, plants like this one become unfamiliar, even though they never stopped being useful. For today's gardener, this understanding is freeing. It means you don't need permission to grow something valuable. You don't need it to be popular or heavily advertised. You can choose plants based on how well they serve your needs, your soil, and your time. When you do that, gardening becomes simpler and more personal, not driven by trends or purchases, but by quiet decisions that add up over seasons. That clarity replaces frustration with perspective, and once you see it, choosing what to grow becomes less about what's promoted and more about what truly works. By now, the idea of one plant doing many jobs no longer sounds abstract. This is where it becomes practical, because each part of the plant meets you at a different moment in the season, and each one fills a real place at the table. The seeds come last, and they're the anchor. When the pods are left to mature and dry, you harvest seeds that store easily and cook like familiar dry beans. This is the part you plan around, the pantry staple. They're filling, versatile, and dependable, the kind of food you build meals from rather than add on as an extra. Earlier in the season, the leaves quietly carry their weight. Young leaves are tender enough to use fresh, and as they mature, they hold up well to cooking. They don't replace your favorite greens, but they extend them. When other plants slow down or bolt, these leaves keep coming, offering steady harvests without weakening the vine. Then there are the flowers, which often surprise people the most. They're edible, mild, and traditionally used in everyday cooking in many regions. They appear while the plant is still actively growing, adding another layer of food without asking you to choose between harvest and productivity. You can pick a few, enjoy them, and the plant keeps moving forward. The pods arrive next, and this is where timing matters. Picked young, they're tender and substantial, not flimsy. They don't store long, which encourages a simple habit: harvest what you need, eat it fresh, and come back tomorrow. For home gardens, that rhythm is a strength, not a weakness. It keeps meals connected to the garden instead of the freezer. And finally, below the surface, the tubers develop slowly. They're not obvious and they're not rushed. You dig them when the season winds down, when most plants are finishing anyway. They feel like a closing gift, a root crop with more substance than expected, rounding out the season just as you think the garden is done. This layered harvest is what makes the plant satisfying. You're never overwhelmed, never waiting too long, never left with just one outcome. Food arrives in stages matching real life. If you're watching this and thinking about where you garden, let me know in the comments what growing zone you're in. It helps others see what's possible where they live. And if any part of this plant surprised you, I'd love to hear which one stood out. If you're enjoying these kinds of practical, grounded garden stories, consider subscribing. We share this kind of wisdom every week, focused on plants that earn their space and reward patience. This is what abundance looks like when it's done well. Not excess, not waste, just one plant, meeting you again and again, with many meals along the way. While this plant faded from mainstream gardening conversations, it never actually disappeared. In many parts of Asia and the Pacific, it remained exactly where it had always been. In home gardens, small plots, and local markets, growing quietly as it had for generations. There were no rebranding efforts, no campaigns to revive it. People simply kept planting it because it worked. In these places, knowledge didn't come from manuals or research papers. It moved through families. Grandparents showed children when to plant, which parts to harvest first, and how to cook what the vine produced. Seeds were saved, shared, and replanted without ceremony. The plant wasn't treated as special or rare. It was treated as dependable. You can still see this today if you walk through traditional markets. Fresh pods piled alongside other everyday vegetables. Leaves sold without explanation, because everyone already knows how to use them. Tubers dug at the end of the season, not advertised as unusual, just understood. This kind of continuity doesn't rely on trends or approval. It survives because it meets real needs. There's something grounding about that. It reminds us that useful plants don't need constant validation to remain valuable. They don't vanish just because they fall out of fashion. They stay alive in the places where food is grown for living, not for headlines. For gardeners watching from elsewhere, this offers an important lesson. Not all wisdom moves forward through institutions. Some of it stays rooted in daily practice, carried by people who value reliability over novelty. Paying attention to those quiet traditions isn't about looking backward. It's about recognizing that some answers were already found long ago and patiently kept alive by hands that trusted experience over trends. That kind of knowledge deserves respect. And when we bring it back into our own gardens, we're not reviving something lost, we're reconnecting with something that never actually left. At this point, growing this plant shouldn't feel intimidating. In fact, it's one of those crops that becomes easier the more you understand what it actually asks for, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. This plant is most comfortable in warm conditions. It likes heat, steady sunlight, and a season that doesn't rush it. If you garden in a warm or tropical climate, it can be planted directly after the risk of frost has passed and left to grow at its own pace. In slightly cooler areas, starting seeds early, or giving the plant the warmest, sunniest spot you have, makes a real difference. Think of it as choosing a location where summer lingers a little longer. Because it grows as a climbing vine, support is essential, but it doesn't need anything fancy. A simple trellis, a fence, or even sturdy poles tied together will do the job. Once it starts climbing, it naturally lifts itself upward, keeping growth tidy and making harvesting easier on your back. Vertical growth also means it fits well into smaller gardens without crowding neighboring plants. One thing that surprises many gardeners is how little feeding it needs. This is not a heavy feeder that demands constant attention. In fact, adding too much fertilizer can work against you. Healthy soil, consistent moisture, and patience are far more important than products. Let the plant settle in, and it will take care of much of its own nutrition as it grows. The growing season is long, and that's not a drawback. It's part of the reward. The plant doesn't rush to finish. It develops steadily, producing food in stages rather than all at once. That slower rhythm makes it forgiving. Miss a day in the garden and nothing is lost. As for seeds, they're more accessible than many people expect. Gardeners share them, specialty suppliers carry them, and even dried seeds from certain markets can be viable. Once you have them, you're no longer dependent on finding them again. You save what you grow and continue. Taken together, this is what empowerment looks like in the garden. No complicated schedules, no constant buying. Just a plant that grows with you, responds to simple care, and rewards consistency over perfection. This isn't about mastering something difficult. It's about realizing that growing food can be steady, forgiving, and completely doable. When you step back and look at this plant as a whole, it becomes clear that it represents more than a clever gardening choice. It points to a different way of thinking about food, not as something you constantly chase or replace, but as something you build a relationship with over time. A plant that feeds you, improves your soil, and asks very little in return changes how the garden feels. It shifts from being a list of tasks to something steadier, something supportive. Choosing plants like this is a quiet form of independence. It doesn't reject modern gardening. It simply reduces how much you have to rely on it. Fewer purchases, fewer corrections, less pressure to keep up. Instead, the garden becomes a place where small, thoughtful decisions add up season after season. Food that gives back, soil that improves, knowledge that stays useful instead of expiring. If this way of growing resonates with you, take a moment to show your support. Giving this video a like helps this kind of practical, grounded garden wisdom reach more people who are looking for calmer, more reliable ways to grow their own food. And if you'd like to be part of a community that values patience, simplicity, and plants that truly earn their place, leave a comment and share a bit about your garden. Your experience matters here. For more gentle guidance, thoughtful plant choices, and garden wisdom that grows with you, consider subscribing to Golden Garden Days. We're here each week, exploring crops that reward care and consistency. Until next time, keep your hands in the soil, your heart in the garden, and your days golden.